Hello comrades, and welcome to another video on the Russian Revolution Area of Study 1. In this video we are continuing our look at the period of dual authority from March to September 1917, so immediately following the February Revolution and immediately prior to the October Revolution. If you didn't see part 1, go back and watch that, as that looks at the first few months of the dual authority. In this video we're looking from June onwards. Now we'll start with the June offensive. So on the 14th of May 1917, Minister of War Alexander Kerensky, who had previously been Minister for Justice and newly appointed Minister of War, he announced that an offensive was required to restore the morale of the Russian military. It's important to remember that at this time, World War I was very much still happening, and Russia still had soldiers in the war. On the 22nd of May, General Brusilov, who you may remember from the Brusilov offensive from our video about World War I, he was made commander-in-chief, and he facilitated the June offensive, attacking the same location as his previous offensive from the previous year. The offensive made good advances, but 40,000 men were lost, and eventually the offensive stalled. The Germans made a counter-offensive, which led to the Russian army retreating in panic, soldiers deserting their posts, and thousands of officers being murdered by their men. So it did not have the outcome that Kerensky had hoped. In fact, it had the opposite. Historian Orlando Figes claims that 400,000 Russian soldiers fled the front, and the German army advanced 230 kilometers, which marked another military disaster for the Russian army and a huge failure for the new provisional government. The July days. So due to the continued war and economic hardship, worker strikes increased. Remember that the workers did not want to be at war. They wanted peace, which is one part of Lenin's three-part slogan, peace, bread, land. So workers and soldiers who were very much starting to support the Bolsheviks, increasingly used the term comrade instead of citizen as their preferred term of address. Deserting soldiers, who were largely peasants, radicalized, and as Lenin said, they voted with their feet upon return to their villages. And what that means is that they torched manor houses, staff would run off of estates, property was shared out among the villagers, and landowners who resisted were beaten or killed. And so these deserting soldiers went back to their villages and brought about carnage. So the July days. On the 2nd of July, a meeting was held by soldiers of the Petrograd garrison. Trotsky is one of the people that spoke at this meeting, and soldiers agreed to stage an armed demonstration on the 3rd to the 4th of July. The next day, protesting soldiers mixed with striking workers and created an angry mass of armed protesters. Shots were exchanged with right-wing groups, and about 400 people were killed. On the 4th of July, hundreds of thousands were protesting at this point. 2,500 Kronstadt sailors arrived and joined the protests. And at the Bolshevik headquarters, Lenin gave a speech to the sailors expressing confidence in the eventual triumph of the Soviets. Despite the urging of the masses, the Soviet leadership had no desire to take power. Now, the Socialist Revolutionary leader and Minister of Agriculture, Viktor Chernov, was chosen to address the crowd, trying to calm them down. An enraged worker said, is quoted as shouting at Chernov, "Take power, you son of a bitch, when it's given to you." As Chernov tried to explain how the Soviet leadership and socialist ministers were dealing with the governmental crisis, the crowd surged forward and seized him, took him hostage. The Soviet leadership sent well-known revolutionaries, and most notably Leon Trotsky, to save Chernov. And eventually, heavy rain dispersed the crowd. So Trotsky did go in and save Chernov. He went and he shook hands with some of the soldiers, and he gave a short speech, and then he took Chernov back to the Soviet. Now, a continuation of the July Days. Many ministers blamed the Bolsheviks for the July Days. So the Minister of Justice, Pavel Pereverzev, tried new tactics to tarnish Lenin's name. He leaked to the press unsubstantiated or false reports that the Bolsheviks were being funded by Germany. This led many right-wing newspapers to accuse Lenin of being a German spy. So 2 days later, on the 6th of July, Alexander Kerensky returned from the front. Remember, he was Minister of War, and he went to the front to try and rouse up the soldiers. And so he returned with units of loyal soldiers and ordered the seizure of Bolshevik headquarters and issued warrants for the arrest of Bolshevik leaders. Lenin notably went into hiding, then escaped to Finland. Trotsky, along with 800 or more other Bolsheviks, were arrested. Party supporters were attacked and beaten in the streets, and activists were thrown out of factories by angry workmates. So basically, these new tactics of saying that the Bolsheviks were funded by Germany led people, even the workers that had supported the Bolsheviks, this led many people to turn against the Bolsheviks. Now, historian Orlando Figes says that the events of 4th of July were characterized by almost total confusion. The Bolshevik leaders made up everything as they went along. Historian Neil Faulkner says that it was a vast display of Bolshevik power. And Lenin later described the July Days as something considerably more than a demonstration and less than a revolution. So this was quite a significant moment during the period of dual authority, because it swung the support away from the Bolsheviks. So we've got some images here. This is a famous image from the July Days showing the sort of carnage and the chaos that took place, and you can see some bodies there that shows when the protesters and the right-wing groups were firing on each other. Here we've got many of the soldiers and protesters, and we've got a source from historian James White from his book The Russian Revolution 1917 to 1921, A Short History. He says, "The elements of continuity between the July and the October days provide an insight into the significance of both events for the way in which the Bolsheviks came to power. For them, the experience of July, though traumatic, was highly instructive." So, by the way, when he talks about the October days, he's talking about the later October Revolution. So, the experience of July was highly instructive. It showed them what a seizure of power would involve, what kind of opposition could be expected, and what kind of problems they would have to deal with. It showed in particular that in order to take power, they would have to be assured of at least the neutrality of the Petrograd garrison, and that some way would have to be found of ensuring that troops loyal to the government would not stream into the city and overwhelm the revolutionaries as they had done in July. The Kornilov Affair. So, General Kornilov, here's a quote at the top, which I'll expand on later. It's time to hang the German supporters and spies, with Lenin at their head, and to disperse the Soviet. From that quote, you can get an idea of where Kornilov stands in terms of the dual authority. So on the 8th of July, 1917, Prime Minister Lvov resigned and named Kerensky as his successor. Remember, Kerensky was Minister of War. Now he has been appointed Prime Minister. Lvov said, "The only way to save the country now is to close down the Soviet and shoot the people. I cannot do that, but Kerensky can." I should note, this wasn't in some big speech that Lvov gave. This was just him talking to a friend of his. General Kornilov, who hated the Soviet and the Bolsheviks, was appointed commander-in-chief on the 18th of July. So you can see that the provisional government is at this point trying to crush the power of the Soviets. Kornilov wanted a strong government, and soon after his appointment, he gave Kerensky demands, including number one, restoring the death penalty. Remember, that was a reform that took place in the immediate aftermath of the February Revolution, was abolishing the death penalty. So he wanted to restore it. He also wanted a ban on soldiers' committees and political meetings at the front. So he didn't want soldiers organizing amongst themselves and planning any rebellions or mutinies. And he also wanted a ban on strikes with organizers to face the death penalty. So these are all pretty harsh demands. Kerensky was not a huge fan of Kornilov's ideas and gave an evasive response to these demands, doubting his appointment to commander-in-chief. So Kerensky got big red flags from Kornilov's demands. So the 12th to 15th of August 1917, Kerensky organized a meeting of politically interested groups and public figures for the Moscow State Conference. He hoped with this to rally support for the second coalition government, but instead the conference revealed divisions and hostilities within Russian politics, namely that the socialists denounced conservatives, the cadets and military leaders denounced the socialists and accused them of undermining the war effort, and the whole conference was hostile with lots of jeering and heckling between the groups. According to Trotsky, the conference created nothing and decided nothing. So it wasn't a very successful conference. On the second day of the conference, General Kornilov arrived and delivered a speech on the need for order and discipline. Conservatives were really on board with Kornilov. They loved his demands. They really wanted to bring an end to the Soviet. And so conservatives hoped that Kornilov would save Russia, and they threw their support behind him. A continuation of the Kornilov Affair. So the 19th of August 1917, Kornilov ordered Cossack cavalry units to be closer to Petrograd. He intended, he claimed that this was for defense of the city against the Germans, but he in fact intended to crush the Soviet and Bolsheviks. Because Kerensky was himself an SR, so he was a socialist, tension grew between Kerensky and Kornilov, which wasn't eased by each of them receiving different accounts about what each expected of the other. So they were being told different things from different people about what the other one wanted. So on the 27th of August, Kerensky notified Kornilov that he was dismissed. Kornilov rejected this dismissal. He ordered his Cossack troops to prepare to advance on Petrograd to quote-unquote save Russia. So Kornilov is now trying to organize a military coup. In desperation, Kerensky dissolved the coalition government and formed a personal dictatorship. And really desperately trying to stop Kornilov's rebellion, he appealed to the Soviet for help. Much as he had appealed to the Soviet earlier to support against the April crisis. The Soviet leadership agreed to help on the condition that the government released all imprisoned Bolsheviks, and on the 28th of August it established a committee for struggle against counter-revolution to defend the capital. So because Kerensky was in quite a bind, he agreed to these conditions, and the Bolsheviks proved invaluable in the defense of Petrograd. They armed workers' militias, which became known as the Red Guards, and they got assistance from garrison soldiers and Kronstadt sailors. Due to train blocks, Kornilov's troops never actually reached Petrograd. He was bringing troops from the front, and the Kornilov Affair came to an end without any armed conflict. But it was still a planned military coup, and on the 1st of September, Kornilov and his closest officers were arrested and charged with counter-revolutionary conspiracy. So you can see that there is enormous tension in Russia at this time, not only between the Soviet and the government, but also amongst with conservatives feeling that the government wasn't doing enough to stop the Soviet. So the significance of the Kornilov Affair, it weakened the government even more. Crime rates in the cities soared, as did class divisions. Kerensky's reputation was damaged because he needed the help of the Soviet to bring an end to the Kornilov Affair. And so both sides of the political spectrum was wary of forming another coalition government. After the July days when Bolshevik popularity plummeted, the popularity of the Bolsheviks among workers and soldiers grew dramatically after the Kornilov Affair, as they presented themselves as the most energetic defenders of the revolution, and also they were the most actively and vocally against the war. Bolshevik supporters were now armed due to the establishment of the Red Guards. So that's quite significant because that, as we found out with the February Revolution, if you've got revolutionaries, people who are revolting, armed with weapons, then they are more likely to be successful in their revolution. So in discussing the outcome of the Kornilov Affair, Trotsky said, now I don't know why I put this in yellow, it's meant to be in blue for a quote. Trotsky said, the army that rose against Kornilov was the army to be of the October Revolution. So it's quite significant, the Kornilov Affair, because it turned the tides back towards the Bolsheviks. Speaking of, we will talk briefly about the rise of the Bolsheviks. So Lenin has his slogan, all power to the Soviets. The Bolsheviks had demonstrated their effectiveness as agitators and organizers by the contribution to the defense of Petrograd during the Kornilov Affair. They were also the only party that was consistently opposed to the government and the war, which, as I said before, that increased their support. By late August, many provincial Soviets were controlled by Bolshevik majorities. So the Soviets weren't just made up of Bolsheviks, but they were made up of socialists. And now many of the Soviets in the provinces had majority Bolsheviks in leadership. Kerensky organized the Democratic State Conference from the 14th to the 19th of September 1917, and he did this to try and form a new coalition government. Mensheviks and SRs pushed for an all-socialist government, but according to historian James White, the conference decided nothing whatsoever, much like the Moscow State Conference. Following the failure of the Mensheviks and SRs to form a socialist government, Lenin called on the Bolsheviks to prepare for a seizure of power. Trotsky became chairman of the Petrograd Soviet. Remember, Trotsky started when we started looking at the causes of the Russian Revolution, Trotsky was an SD, and then he joined the Mensheviks. He was far more aligned with the Mensheviks, but later on he joined the Bolsheviks. And so he became chairman of the Petrograd Soviet on 25th of September. Kerensky organized a pre-parliament before elections for a constituent assembly. So remember, back in around March, in May, the Provisional Government had tried to make preparations for an election for a constituent assembly. Kerensky felt that it was important to have a pre-parliament prior to that. This opened on 7th of October, but Trotsky, as the chairman of the Petrograd Soviet now, denounced this pre-parliamentary government, shouting in the parliament, "All power to the Soviets, all land to the people, long live an immediate, just, democratic peace." And he then led the Bolsheviks in a walkout to show their disapproval. Lenin returned to Petrograd on the same day. Now, it's interesting thinking about the development of the dual authority, how at the beginning, the Petrograd Soviet was very happy for the Provisional Government to have power. They didn't really want to be completely in control, but they had control of the army, basically. And now Trotsky is being, and the Bolsheviks and the Soviet are being very vocal against the provisional governments. Now, the instability of the provisional government, this is just a final point to note, but the provisional government was actually a series of different governments. Russia went through 5 governments in 8 months, which really showed the instability of political authority in 1917. Alexander Kerensky, who I'll mention in a sec in a bit more detail, was one of the only continuous features of all of these governments. So the first provisional government came about on the 2nd of May, or 2nd of March. The first coalition government was the 5th of May. The second coalition government was the 25th of July to the 27th of August. The Directory was the 1st to the 27th of September, and the third coalition government, 25th of September until the October Revolution, 26th of October. A significant crisis led to the collapse of each of these successive governments, and the last crisis was the October Revolution, which saw a Bolshevik-Soviet government come to power. Now, our next video will be about the October Revolution. Now, I have mentioned Kerensky a lot, and he is a significant figure, significant historical figure that we need to go into a bit more detail to try and give you a snapshot of who Kerensky was. So he was born in Simbirsk in 1881, which is the same place that Lenin was from. In fact, Kerensky's father was the headmaster at the school that Lenin went to, and was headmaster when Lenin was there. Kerensky studied law and history at St. Petersburg University, where he was also attracted to revolutionary politics. So that was around the turn of the 19th century. He joined the Socialist Revolutionaries in 1905. He was imprisoned and exiled in 1906. Remember, this is at the time of Pyotr Stolypin and his the Stolypin's necktie and his exiling many political revolutionaries. And so during that time, Kerensky was imprisoned and exiled. He wasn't exiled for long, and on his release, he became a defense lawyer for people charged with political crimes. He was elected to the Duma in 1912, and he rose to real prominence as a member of the Petrograd Soviet and as Minister for Justice in the first Provisional Government. He became Minister of War during the First Coalition, which we mentioned before, and he ordered the June Offensive, which we know was a huge failure for Russia. He became Prime Minister following the July days, but his political credibility was damaged after the Kornilov Affair. He continued to lead the Provisional Government, but was eventually forced from power with the October Revolution. He fled Petrograd after the October Revolution and eventually left Russia. And he died in 1970, aged 89. I've just put a fun fact at the bottom here. So he had an Australian wife, and he and his wife, when she was quite sick, moved to Brisbane in 1945 to be with her family. And later he moved to the USA, where he taught history at Stanford University. So that quote earlier from Kerensky when he was talking about sorry, I've recorded multiple videos in a row, and I'm forgetting all of the different quotes. But the quote earlier where Kerensky was reflecting on the dual authority, that came much later when Kerensky was a historian. So that's a little bit about Alexander Kerensky. There he is. And I hope that this video has been useful, and the previous video, in learning about the period known as the dual authority. Our next video will be on the October Revolution, when the Bolsheviks seized power. Thanks, I'll see you soon.